Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I have a very special guest for you. I'm here with Dr. Richard Heyer. He is Professor Emeritus in the Pediatric Neurology Division of the School of Medicine at the University of California, Irvine. He is also the editor-in-chief of the journal Intelligence since 2016. His work on the parieto-frontal integration theory with Rex Jung examines the neuroanatomy of intelligence based on neuro-imaging research, and is also the author of a recent book from 2016 titled The Neuroscience of Intelligence. And so today we're going to focus our conversation on general intelligence, IQ, psychometrics, and other things like that. So, Dr. Heyer, thank you a lot for taking the time to be on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I always am happy to talk about intelligence research.
Oh, and it is a topic that really fascinates me personally, and that's perhaps the big reason why I invited you on the show. So let me first ask you, because even before we start diving into intelligence and IQ, perhaps we should start by talking about psychometrics, because IQ is really one of an array of topics that is part of the field of psychometrics, and I guess that we could say that the field itself, mainly probably because of things that happened in the last century having to do with eugenics and Nazism and things like that, when people think about perhaps measuring psychological traits, they get a bit uneasy. So, what would you like to tell us first about psychometrics and why really we have objective ways of measuring psychological traits, including, of course, IQ?
Well, the first thing I would like to say is there's no reason to be uneasy about psychometrics. Psychometrics is just a way of making measurements to quantify psychological concepts that are difficult to quantify. And psychometrics uses very sophisticated statistical methods to do this. It's quite an advanced mathematical field. And it's not just for intelligence, it's for personality as well. So personality and intelligence are the two main areas where psychometrics have been developed. And psychometrics essentially deals with whether a test is reliable and valid. Reliable means that it essentially gives you the same answer every time you take the test, and valid means it predicts something that you think you're measuring. There's some validity to that something. So if you think you're measuring intelligence and there is no correlation between your measure of intelligence and how well you do in school, that's probably not a very good measure. So psychometrics is nothing to be alarmed about. It can be very complicated. Understanding statistics is somewhat mathematical, and people tend not to understand, tend not to like things they can't understand, and because it's mathematical, a lot of people don't really study it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, math is always a field that is really counterintuitive to people in general, so I guess that's perhaps one of the big reasons why when people look at data from psychometrics, it's also a bit difficult for them to perhaps disentangle what's happening there, right?
Yes, but when you start talking about intelligence or even personality and the empirical research, the concepts are not complicated. The concepts are easy. So in my book, which is called The Neuroscience of Intelligence, which sounds like it would be very complex and technical, the book is written with virtually no jargon, so people with no background can understand it. And it's very heartwarming for me to see reviews of the book where students and lay people say that they can easily understand what I've written about very complex things. So it's a subject that is accessible if people make a little bit of an effort.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes specifically to intelligence, what are we really talking about here? What is the proper definition of intelligence?
Well, just remove the word proper. There are let me see if I can clarify. Intelligence and IQ are not the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Okay, it's used synonymously. Those two words are used synonymously all the time. IQ is used as a shorthand for intelligence, and the word smart is thrown in there as well. When researchers talk about intelligence, most of the research that's been done on intelligence is done on something called the G factor, where G stands for general intelligence. It's not possible to have a direct measure of the G factor. It's a psychological construct. But the G factor, G for short, can be estimated using psychometric tests. An IQ test is an estimate of the G factor and some other factors as well. But IQ is a score. Okay? Right. IQ is a score. And the IQ score is a good estimate of the G factor, but the G factor is not the only factor that comprises intelligence. There's a verbal factor, there's a numerical factor, and there's a visual spatial factor are the three big ones. But because verbal measures, numerical measures, and visual spatial measures are all correlated to each other, they're not completely independent. This implies that they have something in common. And what they have in common is the G factor. Now, most research is done on the G factor for two reasons. First, there are good measures, good ways to estimate the G factor empirically, like an IQ score. And secondly, the G factor by itself accounts for about half of the variance among people in all measures and variables of interest to intelligence. So it's the single most important factor by far. So if you want to say, as some people think, there are multiple intelligences, you're free to think that, but empirically, when you develop tests for each of the multiple intelligences, it turns out they're all correlated with each other, and there's a very strong G factor. And if you remove the G factor statistically from these other tests, their predictive validity falls dramatically, because the G factor is what predicts things of importance to people.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about measuring IQ, what are the main mental abilities or mental capacities that we're talking about here that fall under its rubric? Is it attention, memory, information processing speed, things like that, or what else?
Well, first of all, there are different IQ tests. The standard IQ tests are really a battery of tests with anywhere from 9 to 13 or more subtests. And each subtest samples a different mental ability from which you extract the G factor, which on an IQ test is the total IQ score, is the best estimate of G. But there are these sub-factors as well. The G factor on an IQ test is really kind of the most critical thing. There are tests called IQ tests that are not really a battery of tests. There's like one kind of ability. So, for example, the Raven's test of abstract reasoning is a good measure of the G factor, but it just measures your abstract reasoning ability. Analogy tests, one kind of test, is also a good estimate of the G factor. Vocabulary tests are a good estimate of the G factor. The block design test, where you have to create designs with blocks, that's a good estimate of G. But no single measure of G, like the ones I just mentioned, are as good as when you extract a G from a battery of tests. That's the best estimate of the G factor. And if you have a battery of, say, a dozen mental ability tests, we'll call it battery A, and then you have battery B of a different set of a dozen tests, and battery C yet a different sample of a dozen tests, you extract a G factor from battery A, from battery B, and battery C. Those G factors are correlated with each other about 0.9. So if you have a good battery that samples a wide range of tests, and you give it to people with a wide range of mental ability, you get a very stable G factor. Now, if you give an IQ test to students at an elite university where the students have been selected for high intelligence, you get a very narrow range of scores. It's called a restricted range. And in that circumstance, if you try to use those scores to predict how those students do at university, you won't get a very strong prediction because there's no variance. But if you give intelligence tests to a wide range of people with a wide range of abilities, then you get a very powerful prediction of academic success. It's not perfect because academic success, life success, vocational success, these things don't depend just on intelligence. They depend on personality factors, motivation, and many other things as well, including your health and your luck. You can't diminish the role that luck plays in many aspects of life's success. But the single most predictive thing, the one thing that's most predictive of life success, academic success, vocational success, is your G factor. Now, if you're in a job that doesn't require complex thinking, the G factor has no predictive validity. But if you're in a job that requires complex thinking, then the G factor is very predictive of how well you do that job. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it makes
sense. A long answer to a very precise question.
Yes, but it's important for us to have those sort of long answers because it's important to really clarify things here. So, and we're talking about testing and measuring IQ. So, what would you say are some of the inherent limitations of IQ testing, taking into account? Yes, please go. No, go ahead. Yeah.
There's one major limitation of an IQ score. Mm-hmm. And I will demonstrate it simply by saying that a person with an IQ of 140 is not twice as smart as a person with an IQ of 70. A person who weighs 200 pounds is twice the weight of a person who weighs 100 pounds. 100 yards is twice, or 100 meters is twice the distance of 50 yards or 50 meters, because distance and weight are measured with what's called ratio scales. There's a zero, you can have zero weight, you can have zero distance, okay? And every unit along the dimension is equal. IQ scores are not ratio scales, they're interval scales. So to oversimplify, if someone asked you to rate how happy you are on a scale of 1 to 10, and you say 10, but somebody else says 5, that doesn't mean you're twice as happy. What does a 10 versus 5 mean? It's not, what are the units of happiness there that are equal? So people often mistake IQ points as if they were pounds or kilograms or yards or meters, and they're not. Nonetheless, it's still a quantitative measure, so you can still do quantitative studies with an IQ score, but you have to understand that limitation. Let me illustrate it in another way. If you take an IQ test, a good IQ test, when you are sick and you have a fever of 103, and you finish the IQ test, you will get a score. That score will be a bad estimate of your underlying intelligence. If you wait a month and take the IQ test again when you're feeling great, and you get a much better score, no one will say your intelligence increased over that month. The second score will be a much better estimate. That's why, for example, in the United States, when you take a standardized test for college admission, like the SAT test, the colleges and universities allow you to take the test multiple times, and they'll use your best score because that's the best estimate of your underlying ability. For most people are surprised when they retake these standardized tests and essentially score the same, because the tests have good psychometric properties that make that true. It's not true for everyone, and you can improve your score with training, but they're not training you to be more intelligent. They're kind of reminding you of some mathematical things you learned in high school that you have forgotten that are helpful on the test. But they're not making you more intelligent. So if you want to lose weight and you go to a weight loss program and you check your weight before and after, and if you lose 20 pounds, the program is a success. If you want to increase your intelligence and you do an IQ test and then you do memory training or listen to Mozart or one of those things, you take the IQ test again and you see your score went up, you can't really conclude that your intelligence has increased. That's a limitation. So again, another long answer to a precise question.
Mm-hmm. But about the tests themselves, because sometimes people come or put on the table some criticisms about them, and they say that perhaps the questions that are asked are culturally constrained, and they also say that, for example, if people go to the test and if, for example, they are high in neuroticism, they get too anxious or too nervous, and perhaps they don't get a good score because of that. Or, I mean, to those kinds of criticisms, what would be your reply?
Those are two different kinds of criticisms.
Right.
The first kind, that the test is really culturally sensitive. This has been studied for 60 years. There have been hundreds of studies of this. And the bottom line is there is no cultural bias in these tests that is meaningful. So, of course, if you take someone from a different culture who's not an English speaker and you give them an English test, they might not do so well on the verbal part, although on the mathematical part they'll do fine. But if you take a question like on the WACE IQ test, the most widely used standardized IQ test, there's a general information section. I'll make up an example. And the question might be, how far is it between Washington, D.C. and Las Vegas? Well, how would you know this? It's not a fact you would keep in mind, but you might reason, well, the country is about 3,000 miles. You're starting on the East Coast, you're going almost to the West Coast. Let's say 2,500 miles is a reasonable estimate. So if the choices are something around 2,500, 5,000, 680, you're going to be in the ballpark. You know, you can kind of reason that out. But it turns out that scores on the general information test show the least difference between different groups of people. So the items you think would be most culturally biased, in fact, show the least differences among groups. And items that you would think would be the least culturally biased tend to show the most difference. Now, it turns out that people have tried many years ago, and this research goes back decades, they tried to develop culture-free tests. And they also tried to develop tests that were biased deliberately for some groups to show that you could have test bias. When you develop a test that has questions on it that only certain groups can answer, of course they do better than other groups. But when you try to predict anything from that test, it has no predictive validity at all. Whereas a standard IQ test predicts equally well for everyone, no matter what group they belong to. That's the psychometric definition of bias. So a test like the SAT for university admission, if that test was biased, people who scored low on that test when they got to college would do better than the test predicted. The test would be biased against them. On the other hand, if the test predicted that people would do well in college and they don't, the test would be biased in their favor. But there is no bias like that in these standardized tests. The tests have been very carefully constructed to remove any items that would produce that kind of bias. So the criticism that these tests are culturally biased is true only in the broadest sense. If you take some of these tests to cultures that are completely non-Western cultures, there might be some impact. Okay, but it's a trivial criticism for the use of these tests in general. The other criticism, I forget now what it was. You gave me two.
It was mostly about the conditions where people take the test, basically. Yes. That. Yeah.
Well, there's some truth to that. There are people who get so nervous that their scores are not as high as they could be. But it's unlikely that that nervousness results in a giant deficit in their score. It's an example of getting a less than strong estimate. Now, most people, when they get in the testing situation, they focus and they're okay. But if they don't do well, they say, well, I was so nervous. But again, this has been studied a lot. You don't cause a very big change on scores. And sometimes people use that as an excuse.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and when it comes to the predictive power of IQ or an IQ score regarding life outcomes, what would you say are some of the most surprising correlations between IQ scores and life outcomes for people?
Okay, before I answer that, let me go back to the previous question and say, because there are people who don't do well on the tests, and it, for reasons that have nothing to do with their underlying intelligence. That's why selection for vocations or universities or colleges don't rely just on the test. They look at other things as well to get a picture. But I also want to say that if you could only have one piece of information about a person that would be the most predictive, it would be a standardized test score. It wouldn't be perfect prediction, and you're going to make some mistakes. You know, you'll deny people who should get in, you'll let people in who shouldn't get in. But the question always is, if you use a standardized test in your decision making, do you create more or fewer errors like that? And all the research shows essentially you create fewer errors, not zero errors, but fewer errors. So now, going now to the question you just asked, you have to ask it again, because I'm getting old here and there's only so much I can keep in my memory.
Right, no problem. So I was basically asking because earlier in the interview you referred briefly to the fact that IQ or an IQ score is able to predict, at least to a certain extent, life outcomes for people. So what are some of the most surprising life outcomes that IQ scores have a correlation with?
The most surprising, that gets most people's attention, is that IQ predicts longevity. So there was a very terrific and famous study done in Scotland. In the 1930s, the government of Scotland decided that they would test every single school child on an IQ test. They had various reasons for doing this. And so that data was collected basically on the same day. Every kid in school in Scotland, which was virtually all the kids, took an IQ test in the 1930s. Well, okay, that data was put in a storeroom and forgotten for decades. It was rediscovered by a professor at the University of Edinburgh. They found all this handwritten stuff in a storeroom, and they computerized all of it. And they did a series of studies locating all the people who were still alive, looking up records of who had died, and they have now done brain imaging on many of the people who are still living in their late 70s and 80s. So it's become a very current study, and you can predict things about brain imaging from their IQ scores when they were kids. But the most fascinating thing is if you divide all the kids based on their IQ score when they were a kid into quartiles, the top quartile, the next quartile, the third quartile, and the bottom quartile, and you look at how many people are alive in each of those quartiles, about 70% of the high IQ people are still alive, and about 40% of the lower IQ people are still alive. This is a giant difference. And, by the way, Scotland is a country with universal health care, unlike the United States. In the United States, interpreting this would be very difficult because health care is disparate among groups. But in Scotland, that wasn't true. So nobody knows exactly yet why that difference exists. But it's a very dramatic difference that shows that smarter people tend to live longer.
Mm-hmm. Right, so I guess that one of the most controversial topics when it comes to IQ and general intelligence has to do with the percentage of variation that comes from the environment and also from genetics. And we have to resort here perhaps to behavioral genetics and studies done on twins and adoptees and other things like that. So with the evidence that we have now, what are genetics and the environment? I mean, what percentage of the variation does each of them predict for IQ?
Well, there's no controversy about the data, or very little controversy about the data. Most of the controversy has gone away because the data has gotten stronger and stronger and stronger because the studies have gotten better and better with now giant samples of twins. and twins reared together, twins reared apart, very sophisticated statistics. And it turns out that genetics accounts for as much as 80% of the variance among adults. Mm-hmm. Among children, it's up around 50% or even 40%. But as you get older, genetics accounts for more and more of the variance. People who thought the environment was important were very confounded by that result. You would think if the environment is important as you got older, the environment would be more important, but it's the opposite. So it's non-controversial that genetics plays a major role. It is not the case that your intelligence is 80% genetic or my intelligence is 80% genetic. That's kind of a misreading of the statistics. What it means is that 80% of the differences among people, on average, have some genetic basis to it. Now, the genetics, that statement is tricky because genes don't express themselves without an environment.
Right.
So the way genes express themselves in interaction with the environment is extraordinarily complex and really just beginning to be studied. And so there's a lot of mystery about this. It's a very hard set of puzzles, very difficult to tease out. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean it can't be studied. It's just going to take a long time to figure out the major interactions. But part of what's emerging is the concept that the environment has two broad components. The shared environment, so kids growing up in the same family have a lot of shared environment. They have the same parental guidance, the same schools, the same social economic status, many of the same friends, but they also have the non-shared environment, the unique experiences that each person has, even though they grow up in the same family. Well, there's an emerging idea that the non-shared environment, statistically, includes random events during brain development. So you could have identical twins, and they have the same genes, and during the first years of life, as their brain is developing, there can be random events at synaptic levels, at neuron levels, that shape some neurons grow in this way and some go in that way. And that's why identical twins are not completely identical when it comes to their brains and their personalities. There are still differences. Those random events may or may not be influenced by environmental factors like stress. Whatever environmental factors are involved seem to be very general. No one has ever been able to identify specific environmental factors other than toxins like lead that impact brain development and intelligence. There's an emerging field, a very nascent field of epigenetics, trying to understand how genetic expression is modified by environmental factors. So far, there's not much data to show specific environmental factors affecting specific genes related to the expression of intelligence. There are many people who are expert in this who are not very optimistic that anything will be found of relevance for intelligence, and there are some people who are very hopeful that some environmental conditions will be found that impact genes because they hope you'll be able to influence genetic expression by manipulating environments. I'm not so sure that's going to be possible because many things have been tried up to now and they've all failed when it comes to increasing intelligence, for example. I'm much more interested in my book talks about the potential for manipulating the biology, the neurobiology of the brain to increase intelligence. No one has done that yet either. But I think that is a more likely path for the future once we understand more about the neuroscience, the molecular basis of intelligence. And that is a very new field, but it is developing rapidly because of DNA technology. So now, you want to talk about group differences. It's always been controversial how you define groups, and it has been the most controversial aspect of this, and whether groups have any biological differences that are meaningful. But now we're getting studies where you define groups based on their DNA heritage. This is about as scientific as it's going to get. And many of these studies are looking at intelligence, trying to find genes related to intelligence. So far, most of that work has been done in European ancestry people, but their data is being collected from around the world on virtually all groups. The data is being collected by multinational consortia that are pooling their resources to get very large samples. And we've seen one group has published now on genetic relationships to intelligence in a sample of over 1 million people. Million people. I mean, my first brain imaging study had a sample size of 8 people, not 800, 8. And now we're having these samples with DNA analysis of over 1 million people. And the data that's being collected, these data are being funded by governments who require the researchers to make the data available publicly so all researchers can have access. And so we're now seeing a lot of papers come out very quickly because of this. And we're getting hundreds of genes being related to intelligence. It's going to be a very complex genetic story. I mean, I think the hope originally was there would be a handful of genes that were really important for intelligence. The best estimates now are there's probably 1,000 genes, each with a very small effect. And they all interact with each other. And so that's why disentangling this in some ways is a nightmare. But all neuroscience, when you start, is a nightmare. But, people from around the world work on it over time. It takes decades. And then suddenly you realize that of the 1,000 genes, there may be 200 or 300 of them that are really critical. And most of them have to do with synaptic development, neuron development. And now suddenly you have a pathway that's a lot more narrow where you might be able to intervene. But we're not close to that yet. But we're working toward that.
Okay, so just about this question again, and this comes from the conversations that I've been having with behavioral geneticists, particularly with Dr. Robert Plomin and others. I think that when it comes to environmental effects, there are 3 main things here that we also have to take into account, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And the first one would be that we have gene-environment correlations as well. And so we have, for example, active gene-environment correlations where the person itself goes and looks for an environment that really is suited to her psychological proclivities, let's say. The second one, I guess, has to do with the fact that the effects of the environment are always necessarily biologically mediated. That is, we can't really separate something that comes from the environment and operates on an organism without knowing how the organism processes that information. And the third one, and the last one, would be the fact that it is extremely difficult for us to really isolate and control for environmental factors, because the environment has several different things happening at the same time. I mean, am I correct, or do you
Yes,
agree
no,
or
and
disagree?
those are all fair, those are all fair statements. Plomin is, I think, the world expert in this. And those are all fair statements. And they give some hope to people who believe the environment is really important. But each of those three things, while it acknowledges a possible role for the environment, I'm not convinced that role is that important compared to the genetic unfolding, and the random events might be more important than those environmental inputs. We don't really know yet, and I understand why people are hopeful about the environment. But if you step back and say, if you go to your physician and he says, well, you have a very bad disease, but the good news is it's caused mostly by your genes or mostly by your environment, which would you rather hear? In the 21st century,
Right.
something that's caused, we're learning how to manipulate your genetics. But if something's been caused by your environmental exposure for the last 30 years, we don't know what to do about that, other than maybe some biological intervention. You can't change the environment. And so the way I think about it is, we're more likely, in the future at least, to be able to manipulate the genes and the neurobiology that comes from those genes to correct something about intelligence than by manipulating the environment. So, for example, early childhood education used to be called compensatory education, but it turns out nothing you could do in early childhood in education raised IQ. Nothing. It's been tried a lot, and it's been tried an awful lot with a lot of earnest, focused attempts, and they all fail. Okay, well, we can keep trying. I'm not against it if you come up with some other way to do it. And I'm not against early childhood education. It has many other positive benefits. It's just that raising IQ is not one of them. That's why they don't call it compensatory education anymore. They call it early childhood education. They started to call it compensatory education in the 1960s because they felt that they could compensate for early bad environments by giving good preschool, and that would narrow the gaps in mental abilities. It didn't work. But early childhood education has other positive long-term benefits. I'm not against it, but it doesn't raise IQ. What does raise IQ? Well, so far, nothing. But I'm hopeful that understanding the neurobiology will be a better route than environmental manipulations.
But when it comes to genetic manipulation or genetic engineering in the future, don't we also have to take into account the fact that probably many of those 1,000 genes, let's say, might have pleiotropic effects? And so don't we have to take into account that perhaps if we are changing, let's say, 20 genes to raise IQ by 2 or 3 points, something like that, let's say, that might interfere with other bodily functions, for example?
Yes, that's actually likely, from what I understand from my friends who do this work. And that's why everyone is recommending caution in proceeding with genetic manipulation. But there's a indirect kind of manipulation. If you know what the genes do,
Right.
what their function is, how they express themselves, you might manipulate the biology downstream without changing the genes. You might be able to manipulate something about, the 100 steps or the 1,000 steps between a gene turning on and some outcome, phenotypic outcome over here. Could be 1,000 steps, just this. I imagine a cascade of neurochemical events, and there may be one or several places in that cascade where you can intervene with something to change the phenotype. We do this in genetic risk for heart disease. We change the diet and we lower stress. We increase exercise. Those are all environmental things that in some ways modify the genetic expression. But there's nothing like that yet for intelligence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's take a step back and now focus a little bit more on the neuroscience of intelligence itself. So what are the aspects of brain structure that go associated with IQ and intelligence?
Well, here's what we've learned over the last couple of decades. It used to be believed that intelligence and abstract reasoning was a function of the frontal lobe. We now know from brain imaging that while the frontal lobe is involved, there's really an orchestrated set of brain areas that are involved. It's not just the frontal lobe. We proposed, based on brain imaging studies that we saw back in 2007, there were a number of brain imaging studies of intelligence by 2007, we proposed that the key areas were in the front and in these side areas called the parietal lobes, and the crosstalk back and forth, as well as some areas in the temporal lobes, some of the memory areas, and some of the other perceptual areas. So it's really the whole brain is engaged. So we knew that by the first decade of the 21st century, which was a change from the previous decade, which was based on just neuropsychology testing and inferences about the brain. Brain imaging changed everything. And so the first thing we learned was the distributed nature of intelligence around the brain. Another thing we learned was that the way different brain areas talk to each other can be more or less efficient, and more efficient communication among the critical brain areas seems to be related to higher intelligence. This is not quite as robust a set of findings as the distributed nature, but people are still working on this. We first reported this efficiency idea in 1988, just to give you an idea. And people are still working on studies now trying to understand brain efficiency, but now they're using tools that we didn't have. They're using tools that are mathematical tools that quantify the connections among brain areas, the structural connections and the functional connections while people do problem solving. And they're seeing not only what brain areas are involved, but how those brain areas are communicating. And there is emerging evidence that supports the idea of brain efficiency being related to intelligence, but it's a very complex story. So we've gone from thinking the brain, it was just the frontal lobe somehow that was related, and the presumption was, by the way, the bigger the frontal lobe, the better. Now we know there's more of a distributed network or set of networks in the brain, that the way these areas communicate are important, And now all of that is being tied to genetics based on DNA analyses. So we are now in a position where some groups have successfully predicted IQ scores from brain images. Other groups are beginning to predict IQ from DNA analysis. And I think once the two are put together, we're going to be able to predict IQ scores reasonably well from a combination of brain images and genetics. So, you could go to your brain imaging center, spit in a tube for your DNA, take a nap in the scanner for 20 minutes, and come out with an estimate of your intelligence that may be a better predictor of your college or university success than the standardized tests. Wouldn't this be interesting?
Yeah, that would be really fascinating. Yeah, but when you told us about efficiency, does that mean that brain areas that go correlated with IQ get less activated in more efficient brains? Is that it?
That would be a main hypothesis. Right. And that's what we found in 1988 using positron emission tomography measuring glucose metabolic rate in the brain. But the sample size was only 8 people. But now there are much more elaborate studies. Some are consistent with that fundamental hypothesis. Others are not. There seems to be certain conditions under which you see brain efficiency and other conditions that you don't. And there seems to be a sex difference. Women seem to have more efficient brains than men in some studies, which is fascinating because women on average have slightly smaller brains, yet there's no IQ difference. Mm-hmm. At least the weight of evidence right now is that there's no IQ difference. There's some emergent evidence that there might be a tiny difference. But assuming there's no difference in average IQ, but women have smaller brains, why is that? Well, obviously they must be doing something better with the smaller mass of tissue.
Mm-hmm. So, since you're referring to sex differences, let me just take the opportunity to ask you about this. What does the evidence tell us in terms of what might be some of the main sex differences in terms of different cognitive abilities, and also when it comes to IQ differences between groups, like, for example, the races?
Well, let's take the sex differences first.
Mm-hmm.
That used to be extremely controversial. It's less controversial now because the data are so clear. Unless you believe that sex is not biological, that gender is a social construct. I don't believe that about sex. I'm talking about biological sex, which is, as far as I understand, describes 99.99% of the people on the planet. And the other cases are legitimate cases to understand and respect. But when I talk about men and women, I'm talking about the standard biological definition. Whether there are different genders or not as social constructs, I don't need to comment on that in order to tell you what the intelligence research shows, because there is no intelligence research done yet on those other examples. Mm-hmm. So just talking about biological male and female, there is a small set of cognitive abilities where there's a small mean difference. Some of those abilities, the mean difference favors women, some favor men. There's one that seems to be a little bigger and a little more important. And that one is visual spatial rotation ability, the ability to rotate objects mentally. And that seems to be before I said there are three main factors: verbal factor, numerical factor, and visual spatial ability. Visual spatial ability seems to underlie very strong theoretical mathematical ability, theoretical physics, high-end mathematics seems to require this visual spatial ability, rotation ability. And there is an average difference on this in favor of men, such that at the extreme right tail of the distribution of this ability, there are more men than women. It's not that there are no women who can do this. It's not a bimodal distribution. There are many women who are just as good as the best men, but there are just more men who can do it. That's the easiest way to describe the statistics on this. And that may account for why, it may account partially for why there are more men in vocations like engineering or mathematics or coding. And it's not that women can't do those things. They can do it, but there just seem to be more men who can do it. There's undoubtedly a social, cultural aspect to this as well. In previous generations, there was clear discrimination against letting women even pursue these studies in these areas, let alone actually have a profession. So that is now being slowly rectified. And there are many professional areas where women, the number of women exceed the number of men. I think 60% of PhDs in psychology, or 70% of PhDs in psychology are now women. So you have these imbalances. It is still at issue what causes them, but it is certainly possible that an unequal distribution of visual spatial ability between men and women on average has some role to play in that. I wouldn't overemphasize it, but I think it's probably an important consideration.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to IQ itself, isn't it the case, I mean, I'm not sure if this information still stands or not, but that looking at the distributions in IQ for men and women, that the average for both sexes is pretty much the same, but when we look at the distribution, there are much more men than women, both at the higher end of the distribution and also at the lower end of it, correct?
Yes, that is, I would say that's the current weight of evidence shows that. And the studies that show that are quite large sample studies and very well done studies. So I think that that's true. There's starting to be a couple of papers showing a slight average IQ difference between men and women. But it's about 3 or 4 IQ points, which in my mind is about the standard error of the IQ test. So I'm not terribly impressed, but there's not enough such studies yet for me to shift the weight of evidence, which in my mind is still no average difference.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and by the way, before the second part of my question was about also differences in IQ between different groups, like, for example, the races.
This is the most incendiary question in all of science, not just social science. I think it's an incendiary question, and it's a very hard discussion to have, because most people have a real bias against the discussion. They just feel it's not even a worthy thing to ask. The way I think about it is that there are academic success differences among groups. You want to look at races, you can look at races. It's very controversial because a lot of people believe race is not is nothing but a social construct, and therefore it's invalid to divide people by races. If you look at kids who are not doing well in school, irrespective of their races, the kids who don't do well in school tend to have lower IQ.
Right.
Ironically, kids who are very bright among poor groups, the best way to find those kids and advance them is with standardized testing. This is ironic because it's the standardized testing that shows the average group differences. There is no question that empirically, if you define groups in whatever way you want to define them, if you want to look at self-described blacks, self-described Hispanics, however you would define them to implement affirmative action programs, for example, that there are average group differences. And the most incendiary thing you can say about those group differences is that genetics might play a role. This is absolutely incendiary, and there are people right now who will call me a racist for even bringing the question up. In my mind, we will have some answers to this over the next couple of decades with DNA-defined groups that will be beyond the controversies about how you define racial groups. And while some people may be interested in these differences because they are hateful, awful, evil people that want to divide people based on ideas, discredited ideas about pure blood and all this stuff, that's an illegitimate reason to pay attention. And not to pursue the research because you think people like that will take advantage of it is not a compelling argument, because people who believe that kind of stuff believe it without having any scientific data, and they believe it just as hard after the scientific data as they did before. The scientific data in my mind, has no impact on people who want to hate other people. If it did, they would stop hating other people because the scientific data really shows more overlap than difference among all groups. And the DNA genetics is showing that people tend to be combinations of all kinds of genetic histories. So in that way, hopefully the genetics will at some point lessen these kind of divisions along racial lines. But I think from a scientific point of view, if you have kids who are not doing well in school, you want to know why. And you have to go where the data take you. And yes, the common sense explanation of this, well, they're poor environments, single parent families, they're not motivated. There are dozens of reasons like that could explain the differences. Most of them have been explored in scientific studies, and it turns out most of them really aren't that predictive of who does better. Let's take race out of it, and I will just tell you that in general, when you look at predicting school achievement, and you put in variables to predict school achievement that include tests of mental ability, like IQ tests, you put in social economic status, you put in how good the school is based on however you want to determine that, you put in how good the teachers are, you put in every single variable you can possibly quantify to predict school achievement. Mm-hmm. The variable that is the single most predictive is the mental ability, the IQ and teacher and school variables combined never predict more than 10%. Yet all our efforts to improve school achievement go into better schools, better teachers. I'm not against that, but the data suggests that at best you'll be able to influence 10% of the variance. Motivation, home life, those are all important things. It's not clear what you can do about all that, but there are efforts to do those things. So if you want to understand not how groups are different necessarily, but why some people succeed and some people fail, you got to go where the data take you. And intelligence is an extremely important variable, possibly the single most important variable. And to the extent to which intelligence is influenced by genes, that's something to know about. So it's an incendiary question. I don't have a good answer, but I don't think the answer is don't talk about it, don't study it. I don't think that is really in the long run going to be helpful to anybody.
So would you say that perhaps the best approach here would be for us to, through methods like, for example, the ones that come from population genetics, for us in the future to really properly define different populations of people that perhaps also evolved in different environments or environmental conditions, and so they have different frequencies of genes or groups of genes, and perhaps even we wouldn't really have to use the term race. Even in behavioral genetics, I think that the term that people prefer now is ancestry, but anyway, we can certainly have good scientific methods to study differences in psychological traits between different populations, right?
No, I think that's definitely the way it's going. But the reason you study the differences is not to say this group is better genetically than that group. It's not a question of better. In one group, a certain set of 1,000 genes may be relevant for intelligence. In another group, maybe only 300 or 400 of those genes are relevant, and there's another 600 or 700 different genes that are, we really don't know. But the point is, once you find out, then you want to have interventions based on what you know that might improve the situation. It's always about improving people's lives, not putting people in categories to divide people. It's about improving people's lives. This is what medicine is trying to do. This is what individualized medicine is trying to do. This is why they want to understand genetics. They want to make people healthier and have better lives. And if you can make lives better by taking someone with an IQ of 70, irrespective of race, or an IQ of even 80, and increasing that somehow by 5 or 10 points, this would change everything. This would change the world. People with IQs under 85 in the United States today have a lot of trouble finding gainful employment because jobs now require more complex skills. The factory jobs are disappearing. The jobs that didn't require higher IQs are just disappearing and being replaced by robots and automation and things. And so now you have a lot of people who can't support themselves. And the question is, what happens to these people? What is the role of government? Some governments have safety nets that are very elaborate and good for such people. Other governments don't. The United States is not great at this. We have some safety nets. But on one hand, in the United States, you have about 51 million people with IQs under 85. And you have about, yes, it's shocking, yes, but that's what the normal distribution tells you, 16% of the population. 16%. Now that 51 million includes about 14 million children. This is a large number of people with IQs through no fault of their own, really limits their opportunities in life. So if you can shift that curve a little bit, that's great. But there also is now talk in some countries, and starting in the United States, of a universal basic income to help everyone. But if you don't want to give it to everyone, I don't need it, but you can start with people with IQs under 85, and if you really want to kind of think that through and how that would work, I mean, I think that's an interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, and I mean, this is really dramatic because an IQ 185, I mean, there's really lots of tasks that people like you and me, for example, can do pretty easily that those people find really difficult, right?
Yes, and it makes a big difference in employment and their ability to navigate everyday life. One prominent intelligence researcher said life is a mental test battery. Just navigating everyday life. I mean, it's hard to imagine what it's like to live every day if your IQ is 80. You would have you need to think about this carefully. What would it be like with an IQ of 80 trying to navigate the complexities of everyday life?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really, really hard to imagine. So just before I ask you the last question, I guess that it is very important for us to stress again what you already referred to, that is, whether we're studying differences between individuals or between the sexes or even between groups of people, I mean, we're never really saying, at least if we are scientifically rigorous, that's perhaps more of a philosophical question, that an individual or one of the sexes or a group of people is better than the other. We're just describing the differences, and that's a piece of information that can be really crucial for us to tackle social problems, right?
I think that's a reasonable statement. If you select, excuse me, people for a school, either a high school or a college or a university, based just on an IQ test, just an IQ test, this will guarantee two things. It'll guarantee that most of the students are pretty smart, and it'll also guarantee that you have a very wide range of students on personality, likability, honesty. You have the full range of honesty, the full range of just being a good person. You have some really good people, you have some really bad people. And the reason is IQ scores are unrelated to all those other things by and large. I mean, the personality trait of conscientiousness is related to IQ. So if you select just people on IQ, you'll get a disproportionate number of people who are also conscientious. But by and large, if you want a diverse group of people on everything except their intellect, just use an IQ test. Some will have wisdom, some won't. Some will be ethical, some won't. Some will be likable, some won't. Some will be easy to work with, some won't. And that's just if you select on an IQ test. Now, I believe that all things being equal, having more intelligence is better than less. So that if we were ever to find a way to increase IQ, we would have a moral obligation to do it for everybody. Make it whatever it is. Widely available. But that doesn't mean you're a better person because you're smarter. Right. It's better to be smart than less. It's better to be more smart than less smart, but that doesn't make you a better person. Mm-hmm. I hope that's clear.
Yeah, yeah, and by itself, I mean, just by knowing IQ, I mean, the person could be very low in conscientiousness and be a bad worker, or even someone who is terribly disagreeable, and many other traits that go along with personality, right?
I have spent my professional life, the last, I don't know, 50 years, around extremely smart people. And there are some of them that you wouldn't want to spend a minute with if you had a choice. I know liars, cheaters, and thieves who are very smart. And no, being smart does not make you necessarily a better person, even though all things being equal, you'd rather be more smart than less smart. So if I had an IQ pill, I had two pills, one to make you higher IQ, one to make you lower IQ, who would take the lower IQ? Nobody. If there was a way to help your children be more smart or less smart, would you hesitate on the choice? So there's virtually universal agreement on this. But it's important to make the distinction that being smart doesn't make you a better person. I think that's really the bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Heyer, just one last question perhaps. And I would like to ask you this because nowadays we're very interested in artificial intelligence and artificial intelligence systems. So we've been talking during the entire interview about human general intelligence. What would you say are perhaps the differences that we would find between human intelligence and intelligence as we can program it in artificial mediums? Because I guess that perhaps one of the big problems here is that when we talk about IQ, we are referring to general intelligence abilities or capacities. But when it comes to artificial intelligence systems, we are more focused on developing ones that have specialized intelligent systems running on them, right?
Yes, I think the big difference used to be artificial intelligence had specialized units, mm-hmm. and they weren't integrated into a general system. Now, people working in artificial intelligence, I don't know the history of this, but I know now there is a concerted effort in artificial intelligence to come up with artificial general intelligence. And I see some of the pioneers in this have just won a prize from some organization for working on algorithms to make machine learning more generalized. So it's clearly moving in that direction. And how this will play out, I don't know. But what kind of jobs will be replaced? One job that could be replaced would be radiology. Radiologists now look at a picture and try to discern certain things. Machine learning can do that much better because they look at each voxel in the picture, each pixel in the picture. Radiology is a highly specialized, complex field, but even that may be an example of something that can be done better by artificial intelligence. So it's going to be an interesting world, and maybe whether I can imagine kind of a race to stay ahead between the neuroscience of intelligence, neuroscience methods to increase human intelligence on one hand, and artificial general intelligence on the other hand. Which one ultimately will dominate? I don't know. We already know that artificial intelligence has beat chess and Go players. So, it's going to be a seesaw.
Right. And do you think that through us developing these artificially intelligent systems, that in the future we could also use them as another source of evidence to study our own intelligence, as we're doing with other brain systems, for example?
Well, it will put people like me out of work. We are already using I just read a paper the other day where they used machine learning to look at brain images to predict things about people. So it's coming. I mean, every field will be able to use machine learning and artificial intelligence for insights, and maybe what will ultimately be the most important thing is the wisdom in using those insights. And whether or not that's on the table for artificial work, I don't know.
Okay, so Dr. Heyer, I will be leaving links to your work on the description box of the video. Would you like to make reference to any online sources if people want to get in touch with more of your work?
Well, there's my website, richardheyer.com, and a link to the book on Amazon, or I think all the topics we've discussed I covered in more detail in the book, including the concept of neuropoverty, the idea that there's an overlap between people who live in poverty and people with low IQ, and to the extent to which the low IQ has some genetic influence, there's a neural basis of the poverty. This is an extremely controversial concept, but I do talk about it in the book, and I think people may find it interesting to discuss the concept.
Okay, so I will be including that in the description of the video for people to go and check it out, because I've read the book and it's very interesting. So Dr. Heyer, again, thank you a lot for taking the time to be here with us, and it was really an honor to have you on the show.
Well, I'm happy to do it. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics from a variety of fields. So just to keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you don't like Patreon, you can also do it via PayPal and Subscribestar. All of the links will be in the description box. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my Patreons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelina, Jim Frank, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condreanu, Jana Enninen, and my first producer, Izar Webbe. Thank you for all.